I'm Daniel Bernal, and on this podcast we talk queerness, astrology, and the intersection of both. On this episode, we're joined by Drew Levanti and a new guest, Axel, or Ascended Master Antojai, and we talk about everything from quantum science, quantum physics, to shamanic astrology, wisdom attained through lifetimes of study, and the power of thinking and storytelling in the modern world. This conversation sets the stage for part 2, which will include the October astrology forecast with the perspective of all of our guests. So make sure that you subscribe and find this podcast on Apple Podcasts or on YouTube, where you will be able to catch part 2 in a separate video. But for now, go ahead and sit back and relax because we've got Queer Skies ahead. Hello, this is Queer Skies, and you have Daniel Bernal here with a couple wonderful guests to talk about a lot of great stuff and do the forecast for the month of October 2019. So our guests today are Drew Levanti, who you might recognize if you've seen our other episodes of Queer Skies, and our latest new guest, I'm very excited and very grateful for. His name is Axel, and you can call him Ascended Master Antojai, or Antojai for short. Antojai, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you got onto the podcast?
So hi everyone. Basically, I am a lifelong shaman. I've been doing shamanism since the age of 6 years old. And I've dabbled in a bunch of different kinds of esoteric arts, especially astrology, and how astrology really impacts us with energy. I'm really well known for manipulating energy, like doing energy healing, quantum healing, diving into the subconscious, really heavy stuff like that. And one of the things that I really heavily work with is like the charts and how the energies of these charts drive a person to like really, do certain things and step into certain stages of their life and how to navigate through them all together. I'm the #1 shaman in all of Michigan, and I've expanded my global academy now across the world, where I teach advanced esoteric knowledge and alchemy overall. So, yeah.
That is so awesome. Just as we were kind of talking about like what potential topics were, I was very impressed with how like fluidly you navigated between a lot of different esoteric spaces. And I'm sure some of that has to be from like you said, you've been practicing for years now. But also you started to talk about something that really resonated with me about, it's not just this lifetime that you feel like you've been working on this stuff, and how we can access knowledge that, like anytime we come across a new idea, it's not a new idea. And the idea of, I think a lot of us are drawn to these ancient practices because we think about like standing the test of time, or like, our ancestors being wise. How do we contrast that with like living in a modern world and the like vast knowledge that's available to us in this lifetime through things like the internet, in connecting with people, engaging with people. So those are some of the pieces that I think really spoke to me about like just the transcendent nature of what we talked about in our brief conversation.
Yeah. So, the first thing before we dive into any of it is understanding that everything repeats itself. We already know that with like fashion trends and like other like cosmic events, like we can really start seeing how there's a trend, there's a cycle for everything. So when we think about karma and we think about like past lives and stuff like that, technically those storylines are existing right now, because quantum science has told us that time doesn't really exist. Time is a state of consciousness, a way you observe the rest of the reality, basically. So that means that like each incarnation we have is living a mirrored life right now. And the people that we know in this skin, we actually do know from another lifetime. And we just keep forgetting every time we step into another sleep. This is how we start really diving into what people talk about karma, right? Because when we start talking about like the twin flames, in my career, I've really, like, a lot of people have this misconception of twin flames, which is like, oh, is the person I'm supposed to like grow like happily ever after with? Well, let me tell you, every twin flame scenario I've ever had come through my shop, and me myself personally, blows up in flames. It's just like, it's just energy that's not supposed to be there. And it's because usually twin flames are people who have had a storyline together, like romantically in a parallel universe, which is like quote unquote our like last life. And there's still history there that needs to be answered for. Maybe you killed them because you got really jealous over something. And now in this lifetime, they got in your life and they destroyed your career and left you homeless. You know, it's like that balance of like, hey, your ex just showed up out of nowhere with like a different kind of skin and story, but it's still your ex. And that's one of those things that we like, you really have to start thinking about when it comes to how reincarnation is playing into your charts, because that's something I really experienced personally is I've always felt like that I was an Egyptian pharaoh. I had Egyptian ties. And I started, when I got into my 20s, I started really having people read my charts of all different kinds, like whether they were doing it psychically or they were doing it traditionally. And everything kept pointing back to Egypt. And I inherently knew that. And most recently, I have a friend who has this program that she bought that it basically, you type in your natal information and it then pinpoints places in on the world that tells you, you know, like where you most likely lived. A couple of them are in the middle of the ocean for me. And I've also said I've lived in Atlantis. And I'm just like, holy crap, you know, like it really does, it all clicks in. So when you step outside of quantum linearity and you start looking at your chart in this manner, magic starts happening and you can really start understanding yourself as a divine being versus like just this storyline.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was literally thinking about that when you were saying that everything's pointing back to Egypt. I was like, astrocartography, which I'm thinking is the practice that your friend was showing you. I've got that software too, and I've like been to a place after learning that technique and just had this feeling. I'm like, let me check the astrocartography. Yep, this is a spiritual place for me, or this is a place where relationships become important to me. And I think about that a lot too, as someone who was born in Mexico, but then whose family brought me to the United States, to Minnesota, when I was a baby. So how does that physical transit change what might be in my birth chart, in my you know, that karmic signature? Astrocartography would say, here's how you change it. Here's where the relationship is globally between different points compared to where you were born. And
so you're asking whether or not like how that impacts like your energetic vibration in general. Is it like what you're trying to get to?
Yeah, that's I think the theory behind astrocartography is that it's that idea of like, had you stayed where you were born, you might have experienced that energy differently and the transits differently than if you had moved. And since you can't play both of those out, how do you know which one's affecting you? Drew, is that kind of how you have thought of astrocartography?
Yeah, that's my understanding of astrocartography.
Cool.
It's interesting, like talking about astrocartography, which is seemingly something that's about space. And Axel, you were talking earlier about time. You said time doesn't exist. It's a state of consciousness. I wonder if you could just like get a little more, even more like metaphysical with us and start talking about like time and space and how you see those relating to energy.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked, because that was like going to be like my next idea. So time and space are heavily linked to each other. And if you really think about how quantum science has broken down reality, we've done experiments to see whether or not reality is really based off observation. There's a really famous experiment that was done in the early 70s, I believe, that is called double slit experiment, where they shoot atoms through these slots, and when there wasn't a camera actually watching each atom go through the slot, they went through the slot in a wave pattern, and then when there was a camera, it went in per slot at like one variable at a time. So it showed us that, like, okay, if we understand that time is just an illusion, that means space is also an illusion, because it takes time to get somewhere, to cover that space in between. That means we're constantly stationary in our place and time, and everything is moving towards us or is being manifested instantaneously in front of us. So when we start taking like those concepts into like astrocartography, you really have to start thinking about, does distance really matter? Because all of those portions of yourself, whether you were energetically in a place to get triggered, is ultimately almost very similar to what's been known as a soul fragment, where people, when they go through some sort of like cataclysmic change, their heart or their soul gets fragmented in a space and time because they're living a linear lifetime. So when people learn how to transcend time with their mind, all their soul fragments come back. You're living your vibration across any storyline, any event, because you're whole. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I like, oh, this is so amazing. One of the like things that I can't put down is this recently translated text from a Persian astrologer, Abu Mashar, who I don't know if you want to say like I've been on his wavelength or like been like starting to download information along those lines. But like as soon as I heard about this book, I was like, that's what I've been trying to think about with astrology. It's so I think like the basic idea is, if your birth chart, this is an analogy I'm testing out. If your birth chart is what you're trying to look at, you need a certain lens to do that. And if you've got a telescope that has multiple lenses, one of those lenses is time. And so Abu Mashar always said you have to have the lens of what's going on in the time that you're experiencing it, because that's going to change your perspective on the birth chart. But then there are other symbolic lenses that he uses, and he would say stem from the birth chart. So there's symbolic lenses that are actually closer to what's in the birth chart that you also have to do. And it's complicated because you've got those multiple lenses. And so capturing the experience of the person who's coming to you for that reading or that healing energy, and really understanding not just what was promised in their birth chart, but what are they experiencing right now? What are the lenses they need to hear that through? And how do you know what to even focus on? Because there's especially nowadays, now that we're tracking asteroids and like even like non-corporeal points in the sky, like it's like information overload. Like, what do you really need to hone in on? And the techniques in the book are very complex. It's taken me a while to get through them, but it's that idea that like time has to be a variable that you look at, and it's not the same as, but it's related to location. It's like a I don't know, I'm losing the metaphor. Let's stick with the telescope lens.
Yeah, I definitely understand what you're saying. It's well, what you described essentially is what people describe as multidimensional understanding. That's literally what it is. Like you're able to see, almost like if you're working on Photoshop, like you can see like different layers to the same project and they make a bigger picture. So it's a very powerful concept that if you apply it in every day of your life, like you end up noticing that. The way I like to really think about like charts in general, I look at them as maps to a sea. Ultimately, though, we're in this sea of possibilities, and we have an endpoint. But the the in between can really play out in a totally bunch of different kinds of ways, right? So, and then also if we're looking at like Egyptian alchemy, which is one of my specialties, the Egyptian alchemy speaks of the all, which is like basically every possibility possible that could play out, and it has to exist because the all encompasses itself by just existing. And when you start looking at that, and you start looking at how your chart really like plays into like your multidimensional understanding, you start using it as a reference point to make decisions, not actually how to live your life by. A lot of people end up coming in and they're like, okay, well, tell me about my chart, and they want to turn it into like their Bible, and like it's like, you know, their go-to, this is how my life has to be framed. No, it's only a guideline. Your energetic vibration is going to play out how you get to the end result. And even then, the all is telling you that there's a possibility that if you don't take care of your karma, which is technically playing out on multiple dimensions at the same time, you might not get to that destiny point that you even fathomed was real. You know, so it forces you, Buddha really tells you that like we are masters only of our own reality. So the more you use every tool you have, like your astrology chart, to see like the lessons that are being predicted, if you can try to get to the lesson before it happens, or mature, or delete the karma in some way by looking at like, okay, this is the next destination that's about to happen to me, let me take care of this right now. And then all of a sudden, when you get to that point, you're hitting ascension. You're no longer dealing with karma, you know?
Yeah. That's something I struggle with every time I like want to say anything in astrology, like horoscope or like forecast. Even like people. So we asked for this episode for some questions that people had about October, and when we get to the forecast, that will be interesting. But even then, I have to watch myself as like someone who's using this tool to say like, well, it's not going to just happen to them, right? These are the landmarks that they can use to navigate the month of October. Yeah. They're still at the helm. They still need to be making those choices and decisions. And there are routes that might be closed off right now. And that doesn't mean that you're forced into any one particular route. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's similar to like tarot card reading, if the listeners know anything about that. Mm-hmm.
That's awesome.
So one of the things that is, I think, a pretty common debate among like the astrological circles that Daniel and I run in is this question of like fate versus free will. And once you start to apply astrology and you see it working and you are able to predict these events taking place, then the next question that comes up is, well, how much am I participating in that process of becoming? How much am I actually influencing the things that happen versus how much are they happening to me? So could you just reflect on that a little bit more? I think you were starting to get into it, but it's a really interesting thing that I'd like your perspective on.
So I spent a great deal of my education learning language. I have a degree in psycholinguistics, and basically what it means is like I studied how language programs the mind, how that creates culture, and then how that resonates back, and then it creates like an ideal for all of reality. It's how you see the world, and it shapes your idea of how the world should run. So when we're looking at words in general, what is fate? What is free will? But we're missing a third like variable. What is destiny? And when you look at each word, fate is saying this is supposed to happen. Like it will happen altogether. Nothing's going to stop it. And then a person who really believes in fate tends to feel entitled to things happening for them, and they don't take responsibility for their own energetic vibration. It doesn't happen with everybody, but for a large percentage of people, it kind of like this was my fate. You know, like I can't really construct a higher reality for myself, which quantum science tells us you can with your emotions. When you look at destiny, it's saying this is what's the highest probability. This is where you're supposed to end up. This is where you're going to be helped to get to. There's all these different kinds of ways to get there, but ultimately this is where we want you to be. So it changes fate is like a 3D word. Fate is like you're a victim to what's happening and you're locked into this grid that's supposed to be happening. Destiny is saying you're more 4D, 5D, like you're surfing towards the ideal reality, but there's all these different ways, all these different options for you to get there. You're not locked in this one particular strand of reality that may or may not serve you. So when you change your wording, when you're looking at anything like charts and stuff like that, from fate to destiny, I never tell, like when I'm doing any of my work, I never use the word fate, because then that makes people hold you accountable. Like, well, you said this was supposed to happen. But if you really understand reality and energy in general, everything is based off of like currents and moves. So they're like in Taoism, they tell us that, you know, life is a river, and all you can do is swim with the river towards salvation, or try to swim against it and surely drown. And like, that's why I like to use the word destiny. Now, because destiny exists, and destiny allows you to have all these different options to surf from, you then have free will. And free will is what allows you to be a creator in your reality by how you shift your consciousness and how you use the divine tools around you to navigate to the easiest route to your highest destiny. Which could ultimately, once you understand reality that way, then you could say, okay, when you get to the end point, I was fated to be here because you had already experienced the consciousness of accomplishment. Does that make sense?
Yeah. There's also like a phrase in some like anthropological work that I'm familiar with, which is always already. Like if you're talking about the way things are now or the way that things are about to be, you can say, well, they were always already that way. Things were always already in motion. So I was wondering if that like idea resonates a little bit with what you're talking about, because you said, you referenced this idea of transcending time. And I was wondering like how you help people apply that, how you help people transcend time and act as if they were always already in their destiny or something like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So what I do here in Detroit, Michigan is I have a quantum lab that I run, and it's private, and I test how new energy medicine affects the subconscious and like reality. We actually study how it bends physical reality to do stuff like the weather and other things like that. So when it comes to bending time, the first step alone is just understanding what we're talking about right now, and not just saying like, oh yeah, that's a cool idea, but actually being like, okay, like this is science, this is real. And just to back it up, like there's like the most recent quantum science research that came out was this study with DNA, and it showed us, there's actually been two of them that are pretty famous. One of them showed us that gratitude, when you express gratitude, you literally rewrite how your brain is structured to be happier. So then that like rewrites a bunch of other issues that we understand on the 3D level. There were these DNA tests that were done where we already know that a gram of DNA is worth a 3 terabyte hard drive. So that means our entire system is a computer that's walking. And then if we train ourselves to understand that time is not real and we vibrate that, we become immune to time to some degree. We're still bound to the third dimension. So you can't like try to jump in front of a train and then stop the train from hitting you, because reality is still based off of observation. So if other people are observing you in front of this train and they're like, holy crap, you're gonna like get hit by this train, their willpower, because there's more of them, is going to jump in front of your state. And even if it's not wise for you to defy like gravity or other things like that, because those are so heavily rooted within our DNA. So that was kind of like my warning before we started diving into that. So when we're thinking about time and we start understanding this, we start understanding like how our DNA is, like our body through DNA is a computer. We have to train the computer system. We have to upgrade the computer system to like kind of play around with time, like this idea of your imagination. And when you really start like what I tell my students is less control is more control. We're so conscious, and we try to like, especially when people learn energy medicine, they're trying to like really hold on to energy, force it to do things. when you just talk to it, because energy is consciousness, everything flows. That is like how energy flows. You can talk to it and you can communicate with it if you're one with it. And that's like the biggest understanding that's necessary for that.
I have a quick thought, like, about consciousness and energy. Anytime I hear those words, I perk up, because I grew up with like my metaphysical understanding of the world being consciousness and energy creates the nature of reality. So I was wondering if you see consciousness and energy as like separate things. Are they the same thing? Are they related things? And how do they add up to reality? Because like not everything is conscious, right?
Oh no, that's a lie. So like, just because we don't perceive it to be conscious does not mean that it's not conscious.
Okay.
And I tested this out. Like, that's one of my really well-known experiments, is like, I have had a bunch of people just be like, okay, start talking to your stuff. Like, literally just start talking to it. Like, if I lose my keys, all of my friends have seen it happen. Like, I'll be like, keys, where are you? And I talk to it with love. Like, I'm looking for my dog, right? And then all of a sudden, bam, I do that 20 seconds later, it's right there out of nowhere. And they call me, like, it's like I get gravitated to the room that they're in. And it works for almost everything. Now, it doesn't work with everything, because if everything has consciousness, everything has density of vibration. So like my keys that respond almost instantaneously when I'm looking for them, because I feel like this really deep connection, I have these bone conducting headphones that literally are always disappearing. And I always feel like this headphone is just like, oh, I'm just going to disappear just to like spite you today. And I can really feel it. I can really feel that consciousness. So in feng shui tells us that if you fold your clothes in a certain manner and you really care about, like, you show it love, you taking care of it, it will take care of you. So it lasts longer. If everything is energy and everything is consciousness and everything, the ancients tell us as well, like ancient shamanism tells us that we are the dreamer and the rest of reality is our dream. And if we plug that into feng shui, then like, why are we not respecting ourselves and every movement that we're doing when we're interacting with ourselves? Even from, an actual dog or plant, which we've seen that plants have emotions. Plants freak out if you think about chopping them down. Like, they really like these spike up in their vitals and stuff like that. It's really crazy. They miss people and like all these other things. The same thing happens for a desk or anything else that you have in your house. And in Hermeticism tells us everything is a density of vibration. There are some particles that are vibing so high that we can't even perceive them, or they're moving so fast that it's just light, right? And then there's things that are dense and they're vibrating so slow that they seem like they're not moving at all, but they're still vibrating. So when we're looking at vibration, just in general being consciousness, regardless of how fast it's spinning, you really start changing how you look at the world, and you start interacting with a higher rate of magic or alchemy, which allows you to start even reading and perceiving at a psychic level information that a regular standard 3D chart cannot describe to you.
This is like so in alignment with a ton of stuff that I love about Rune Soup, Gordon White's podcast, just about all the different, his specialty is like looking across time at human cultures and how they're interacting with all of these phenomena. And when we didn't have quantum science, there were a lot of cultures who picked up on a lot of these same phenomena, and the way that they interacted with their environment, if they believed that even the river nearby had consciousness, completely changed how the river took care of them, or how the river treated them when they became ancestors, or how those dynamics worked out. And I think that there is so much about our current society in the Western world that is very much rooted in materialism, and there's a vested interest in kind of distancing quantum science, like, oh yeah, that's like too esoteric, or like it doesn't really have practical implications, aka there's something to it, and it threatens the like capitalist society that we've created. So I think like there's a lot that I would love to change about the way that I think about consciousness, the way that I've been programmed growing up to think about how I interact with my environment. And who knows, if we did that at a large scale, would we be talking about the same kinds of crises, climate crises that we are today? As we're recording this, there's like a huge storm passing by, and I'm like, that energetically changes me, and we are energetically changing it. And so, yeah, I think that gets me going.
Yeah, like so there's this researcher called Tom Chi, and he's been doing this really cool research, which he's found that there's 7% of our body that gets exchanged every day. And within, I believe, a couple hours, the energy that's here is on the other side of the world. So, and it gets recycled through another plant, and then whatever 7% is coming in is coming from somewhere else. So we are like plants ourselves. Like plants filter air, trees filter air. They create the oxygen for us by filtering carbon, right? So like that's exactly what we have to do with our understanding. By just understanding that you have that capability, you can go ahead and start saying, okay, well, the next 7% that comes into my body when that shift happens is going to be like this high density new earth ascension, my high psychic abilities, and everything that's going out is going to be like that crap energy that I've been holding on to that doesn't let me access everything that I am. When you start filtering yourself like that, and you also start filtering the kind of energy you physically consume, because that's really important. Like, one of the things that I immediately will tell people when they start training with me to become an ascended master or anything like that is you got to cut out meat. Meat in all of the esoteric texts talk about death and stagnation. Now, unless you don't know how to filter that through your body properly through alchemy, that gets stored up, and it makes you feel really like lagged down. Sugar would be the next thing that I tell people to be careful with, because it numbs your emotional center, which is your sacral chakra, which then allows you to start perceiving reality based off of attachment. And that's one of those things that you don't, like, the less attached you are to the third dimension, the more physically capable you are in the psychic realms to become an even better reader, to become somebody who can just see their own path, like really play out, especially with like cosmic weather. Everything changes because you're understanding everything from a higher tier of reality altogether, if that makes sense.
I think immediately what made me think of that, like, I feel like I have an unfortunate tendency to like, ooh, new shiny diet, like, let me try that. Like, that programming from society is very strong for me. And so I've like did a year of mostly vegan eating, and was like, you know what, I just feel like crap still. Like it didn't do what I expected it to do. It didn't like transform my ability to do whatever. And as you said that, something just clicked in my head too. It's like, you can't expect to have a physical change like that completely transform what you're doing if you're still operating in the same environment. And I think what I was understanding now is that idea of like unlocking your ability to feel more, or the psychic connection. I think what my body was experiencing was like connecting to the reality of the things that I put myself through for work or for a purpose that I'm driven towards, what I'm expected to do, the amount of effort I'm supposed to do, the standards I'm supposed to adhere to, all of those, that numbing effect is, like operating on caffeine and sugar and like all of that. It's like very much designed to keep you going in that work 60 hours a week and then come home and then you can rest. It's so disconnected. It's so, it really is like putting your blinders on so you can do your 9 to 5 and then come back and like have a separate world. And I think that, that's too much of a shock for a lot of people. It doesn't work for like you can't have those two things coexist. So they go back to what worked for them to exist in that system, and label that change a failure. Like, it doesn't work for me. There's something about me that's wrong. They internalize that. Oof, girl.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing we gotta really talk about though. Like, if you feel like magic cannot help you, like, or alchemy and whatever, consciousness, energy healing, whatever the hell you want to call it, right? Like, if that's something that you feel like cannot affect you, you're saying, yeah, okay, it cannot affect me, it won't work for me. So you need to let go of that. Doesn't matter what level you're at. Like, a lot of times, back to like wording, I have students sometimes that come through and they're like, I just can't. I've tried accessing my third eye. I just can't do it. I can't talk to my guides. I can't. And I'm just like, no, it's not that you can't. It's just like, you just haven't done it yet. Like, let's change that phrasing to like it. And a lot of times people want to like develop these skills instantaneously. It takes a baby several months to like really start walking. Like, you need to put practice into it. You need to train your legs to then sustain your weight. You're changing. Not only, like, a lot of times what I teach my students too is like, when we go through consciousness shifts, we're going through evolutionary DNA shifts at the same time. So like, that's when people start going, like, they start freaking out and they're like, why do I feel so depressed? Why am I stuck in this like PTSD mode? Like, what's going on? Where your consciousness is shifting, and your body, which is a computer and has all the memory, has to like get filtered and deleted and reorganized, so that it can exist in a higher tier of reality. And we always have to keep that in mind when, we're programming ourselves and we're thinking about just our personal growth in general. We just have to make sure that we're not using self-defeatist like ideals or like terminologies to really define what our next steps are. Because if time is an illusion, like, can't is technically locking you in time. And everything that you had just explained too about, like, you try it just doesn't work for you for a little while, and then you just feel like it does not just work for you in general. Like, it's the matrix. What we live in is an illusion that is a matrix, which doesn't want you to wake up, essentially. Like, it challenges you. If you want to think of it as a video game, and when you're leveling up, you have to somehow beat a boss, except this boss is invisible and it will mess with you through other mediums, not just like a head-on monster. Like, you start changing the way you perceive time in general. When you hold out from like these shifts of like, all right, living this 9-to-5 job and like having all these responsibilities and having anxiety, anxiety is tied to usually schedules and a way of life, and not being able to keep up with that. Depression comes shortly after because you are falling behind and you feel like a failure. And then what is that all stemming back to? It's stemming back to time, like the concept of time. How about we delete that and start really believing and seeing for ourselves? This was what I wanted to really drop in earlier, and I think I kind of ran off of my trail then for it now, is the most recent experiments in quantum science have shown there were 3 labs across the world that did not have a conversation about coordinating these experiments. One lab took a guy's DNA and they put it on the other side of the building, and they made him watch like horror movies and then like romantic movies. And then they watched what happened to his DNA on the other side of the building. Well, every time he saw something romantic and happy, his DNA got really relaxed. Whenever he saw something like horrific, it got really stressed. So then a separate team, independent from that, they ended up taking another person's DNA and they put it again on the opposite side of the building. I think it was even a couple miles, really. And what they did was they watched the guy. They had the guy watch some material as well, and then watch what happened to the DNA strand. There was absolutely no transmission time, no lag time from his experience here to his experience, his DNA experience there. That means DNA does not recognize time as a real thing. Inherently, we know it's not real, but we somehow have made it real in our head. The third one, which was most interesting on the other side of the globe, was they took this vacuum, they created a vacuum, and they threw these light photons on the inside. The light photons were just random when they didn't have anything inside of the vacuum. So then they took a piece of DNA and just like a couple of flakes, put it in there. Woof, the light photons started creating a DNA strand, which then showed us that our emotions are impacting our DNA, which is constructing the consciousness around us that we're interacting with in real time, which is driven by our emotions and what we believe in. So if we believe in like certain laws of reality, and I test it all the time, like one of the most mind-blowing ones that I've done that I like, when you really look at it, you can write the numbers 4 to 14. When you consider the laws of quantum reality and you look at 4 to 14, there are 11 numbers total from 4 to 14. But math is telling us that 4 plus 10 equals 14. But that 0 is still something that's being observed by us, which that 0 is not absent. That 0 is actually a 1. So that's why there are 11 units altogether to get to the actual equation, meaning the math that we've been understanding for a while is technically flawed. Then if you look at that same component and you count the spaces in between, there are only 9 spaces in between. That means that 0 doesn't really exist as we know it, because it's actually a 1. And we're not actually representing and understanding that the number 0 or 10 is actually the number 11, the number, yeah, that would be like
number, yeah.
The 11th number. Yeah, it wouldn't be the 10th number. 10 doesn't exist. And then when you kind of like let your brain kind of absorb that and your DNA pattern absorb that, you're going to write it out on a piece of paper and you're going to be mind blown. You're like, wait, what? And then all of a sudden it triggers you to be like, what is real? Like, what is math? And then that breaks time right there. And then you're like thinking beyond that and you just have to embrace it. That was one of the most interesting experiments I've done recently.
That is interesting. I do want to go back to something because it's come up a couple times in our conversation. And it's the idea that, there's so much esoteric stuff out there. There's so many ways that we can believe in a tool that will change us. But I wonder if the most powerful spiritual tool that we have is storytelling. And I think about how important this actually is for every facet of culture and society. And it goes back to that idea of like the power of language. But I think we're starting to, as a society, buy into the idea that's popularized by Brene Brown, the story you tell yourself. And it's that same idea. What you trap yourself in verbally through the self-talk that you have, you're writing your own story, and that is so powerful. You can be your own worst enemy in that way. And on the flip side, if you're intentional about that, you can use that same tool to open those doors. And I think that one of the things that we do as astrologers, as healers, is we tell people stories. We interpret different tools as stories, and the story that we tell them matters. But what if we're giving them the tools to write their own story? What if we're helping them understand the pieces that they have to work with?
And that goes right back to quantum science, which tells us it's all reality is based off of observation. If we're looking at a novel, and this is another thing that like is one of those crazy things I've been experimenting with. If we're looking at a novel, the character inside of the novel is experiencing a reality that can be esoteric to some degree, where they acknowledge a higher consciousness, which is then the reader or the narrator, right? So when you're thinking about transcending your consciousness and applying that in every form, like through language or like experience in general, you start, just like multidimensional climbing, you start shifting yourself from experiencing things as the character and start becoming the reader. And if you become the reader, then you can take the opportunity to be the narrator and then really tell the story how you best resonates with you. And the way you really start tapping into that is, you know, through the concepts that we've been talking before, but also just thinking about how you've used words in the past to define what you're looking at right now. Like, how does something make you feel? How about you change a word that you've always used? Like, oh, like, this makes me feel happy. How about this makes me feel ecstatic? That has electricity behind it. You can feel it, but just even saying it lowly, it has electricity behind it, which is then triggering thoughts. And that's tied to your solar plexus and then your mind, which then moves this energy around here and starts changing how you interact and how you think and how you're constructing actively, because everything is observation, is being constructed as you see it. And quantum science has also gone as far to tell us that reality is technically it's 99.99% empty space, meaning only 0.01% of actual all reality is what we're seeing right now. The rest of it is known as the void. And like ancient shamanistic texts, people definitely meditate all the time and they end up in this like total black void. That is what reality actually is. And we're here on this side, trapped, convinced that everything is constructed from this angle. And that's the biggest lie that we've been fed through not only, you know, like religion, but through our own perceptions of thinking that we're these omnipotent beings that create things and nothing could be more powerful than what we have been perceiving from the get-go.
That narrator complex, if you're not really aware of it, is really overpowering. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we should transition into the forecasts, because I think that kind of sets the stage for like what we're about to say in the forecast really is like the fate. And don't let the fate get the best of you. Think of your destiny, and think of how your free will helps you navigate what we're about to talk about. And I think like this whole discussion was so fantastic. I could keep talking for hours.
Yeah.
But I definitely want to get to the forecast, because I think that given that context, like I think we're going to have a really good discussion. Catch part 2 of our conversation as the October forecast is revealed to you. And in the meantime, go ahead and subscribe to Queer Skies on podcasts or iTunes, and make sure that you are following Drew and Antojai. The show notes has information about how to reach us. And as always, we will see you next time.